All right, let's talk about some important concepts. So McLeod talks about abstraction through cartooning. And essentially what he's saying is that when we move from a realistic image on the left, that's a very specific image. And as we remove detail and work our way to the right, we're essentially stripping the image down to its essential components, right? And making it more universal. So that the image on the left is a specific person. And the further we go to the right, it could be any person as we remove detail. And he says it's not so much about eliminating details as we are focusing on the specific details. In this case, he would say the details that communicate the humanity. Here he goes through an exercise and says, have a friend draw some squiggles on a piece of paper. They can be whatever shape you want them to be. And by simply adding one thing, right, we add this shape, our mind starts to see them as faces. We start to recognize ourself in them. And that we have absolutely no trouble taking a shape like a bullseye, even though it's not the same as the eye, but we see that and we can easily transform it into that. He goes on to show a few examples of how we tend to see ourselves without even thinking. That we anthropomorphize objects all the time. He's even suggesting here that we're looking at this container of Parmesan cheese, grated Parmesan cheese, and it appears to be smiling. The next really important concept is closure. And this is introduced by Marshall McLuhan in Understanding Media in 1964. And he talks about this as the phenomena of observing parts but perceiving the whole, right? And McLeod points this out here by saying, in this panel, you can't even see my legs, yet you assume that they're there. We look at this image where his legs are cut off by the panel, and we have no problem assuming that they're there, despite the fact that, as he says on the right, they're clearly not. His legs aren't drawn, but we see them. We perceive that they are there. So we're filling in information that's not there. The mind connects the images and fills the gaps in the gutter, right? Remember that the gutter is the space between the panels. So we see someone being hit by this axe on the left-hand panel. The right-hand panel, we just hear a scream, and our mind immediately fills in the action in between those things in the gutter. Okay, here's another example of that. We see a series of actions, much like we would look at a series of cells or frames on a film, right? And our mind connects all of those things together. Notice how the time sequence here, we're seeing all of those things at once, right? And it sort of fractures time. This is not unlike seeing multiple perspectives at the same time here, both time and space, like the cubists and the futurists did. So let's talk a little bit more about time and how panels can be used. So here's a great example of how time can pass. And it's not hard for us to look at this and having experience with a situation like this. Someone says something, someone is still and doesn't respond for a moment, and then finally responds, right? So we've all had that experience. So it's not hard for us to understand that they're suggesting in that frame that there's a little gap in the time there where nothing happens. So look at how this changes visually, right? When we repeat that panel, that seems to lengthen that moment even more. Whereas one panel suggested a few seconds gap, now it seems to drag on a little bit longer by repeating it, right? Now here, we've just moved the panels out and created more space in the gutter. Notice how that changes your perception. Here's one more way. So by expanding the panel, showing us more of what's going on around it, right, we again have the sense that that moment is lengthened and taken a long time. And here's even one more that is sort of a subversion of the traditional use of panels, right, or the rectangle as a panel. So by removing the border, McLeod here tells us this takes on a sort of timeless quality, and I don't think that's hard for you to perceive. So these are just different ways in which we can perceive time by the visual representation and organization of the elements. Let's look a little bit here at some of the examples of the expressive quality of line. Okay? So here McLeod is showing us a variety of lines. Some of them are very strong with sharp edges, or they have points coming out. Some of them are rounded. Some are sketchy. Some look like they could discontinue or break off at any moment, right? So this is something that artists take advantage of quite often, and artists who primarily deal with outline, which is a large majority of comic artists, take advantage of this fairly often, right? This is, if not, let's say all the time, right? It's a very consequential design element in comics. Now let's talk about showing and telling, right? So here we're telling a story entirely visually. It's not difficult, as you look at this, to imagine the narrative, or at least imagine a narrative that works with these images. Now here we can tell you what's happening, right? We can give you the words and say specifically what's happening. So I'll give you a second to read that. So what happens now if we combine both of those? What impact does it have when we combine them? What possibilities does the genre offer us for storytelling that's not offered by other mediums? So in conclusion, how does Alison Bechdel utilize the techniques of the genre to tell her story? So on the left, you see an example from the University of Cartooning, or Universality of Cartooning, right? We see an example here of a photographic quality image, or more photographic, I would say, with a lot of detail showing her father, right? And then we have an example of the body as opposed to the beginnings of the chapter. Here we have the body of the text, which is a much more universal cartoon. Why do you think Bechdel does that? What's the advantage to telling the story that way? Okay, if you have any questions about graphic novels, feel free to contact me or talk to your instructor.